begin this morning, Jan Tooney last week brought up a passage of Scripture when we were discussing the doctrine of the silent rapture. And we were looking at the 1 Thessalonians passage, and Jan brought up another passage that's often used by people that hold to that doctrine, that they believe teaches the doctrine of that secret rapture, and it's in Matthew chapter 24. And I hadn't prepared to discuss this last week, and so I wanted to take some time and look over it before I really address it. If you want to turn there in your Bibles, what's under this bench here looks like my garage at home. It's just got everything kind of piled there. So, all right, Matthew chapter 24. Now, again, last week we talked about the fact that this belief in a secret rapture where the church will be called up instantly with nobody knowing anything about it, and all of the people who aren't Christians will be left here on earth to endure whatever comes after that. That didn't even come about until the early 19th century. Before that, no one had ever even discussed it. It didn't even really seem to exist. And when we get to Matthew chapter 24, verse 40 and 41, when we read that, for most of us, we are so familiar with this teaching about this secret rapture that we immediately think that that's what it's talking about. Or if we don't believe in that doctrine, then since we've been influenced by that teaching, we think, well, now we've got to figure out a way to explain this verse away, because it seems that that's what this verse is teaching. Now, had that doctrine of this secret rapture never come about, my thought is we probably wouldn't have as many problems with this text. We would read it, we would fit it into its context, and it would make sense. And so that's what I want us to try to do this morning, is look at these verses in their context and see if we can find out what it originally, how the original readers would have understood what Jesus says here. Now, Matthew chapter 24, Jesus is dealing with the end of time. I think Jesus is dealing with the end of times in two different categories there. At the beginning of chapter 24, it says that he and his disciples are walking along. They're in Jerusalem, and Jesus points to the buildings. And he says, you see these things? You see these buildings and stuff? They're all going to be destroyed. It's all going to be laid level. And so I think at the beginning of chapter 24, Jesus is talking about the literal physical destruction of the city of Jerusalem, which did take place sometime around 70 A.D. It was leveled. But I think later on in the text, he's actually talking about the end of times, the day when he returns. And so in verse 30, I want you to read this with me. We're going to start there. At that time, and I think this is talking about the second coming, not the destruction of Jerusalem, but he says, at that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. Now let me ask you, is this a secret sign that's going to appear in the sky? No. Now, how do we know that it's not a secret sign? Yeah. All nations will mourn. Okay, so whatever this is, everybody's going to know it's happening. And so they is all nations, they will see the Son of Man coming, on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. Who's going to see him? All nations. Okay, so this is not a secret thing. Does this verse sound familiar to what we read in 1 Thessalonians, where it says that the Son of Man will descend on the clouds? Okay, I think Jesus is describing the same event that Paul does in 1 Thessalonians. In verse 31 it says, and he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call. Remember in 1 Thessalonians, Paul says there will be a loud trumpet call. And so he will send his angels, and they will gather his elect from the four winds and from one end of the heavens to the other. And so I think this is a very similar description that Paul lays out in 1 Thessalonians. Loud sound, the Lord will be descending, and all of his faithful will be gathered to him. Okay? I think that fits very well. Now, going on down, and let's look in verse 36, where our troubling verse kind of begins. No one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Now, again, Jesus is very emphatic in several places that nobody's going to know when this happens. Jesus says the angels don't know it. I don't know it. Only the Father knows it. And yet, we spend so much time trying to figure out when it's going to happen. You know, every time something happens, every time a new war breaks out, you know, people start saying, oh, this is a sign, the end is coming. You know, well, we don't know that. Yeah, you're right. The end is coming. Amen. And when is it coming? Soon. That's all we know. It's coming, and it's coming soon. It's been coming, and it's been coming soon for 2,000 years now. God is not on our time schedule. But anyway, moving on. Verse 37. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. And that is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with the hand mill, one will be taken and the other left. Now, there's 2 ways we can understand this text. If we put it up with verse 30, where Jesus talks about the sign that appears, and they see Christ coming, or they see the Son of Man coming, and he sends out his angels, then, you know, 2 men are in the field. They're going to see the sign, they're going to hear the trumpet, and one of them will be taken. In that understanding, the angel would come down, take one of the men, and leave one. The one that's left is left for destruction. Okay? There's no talk about him being left there to endure whatever stuff happens from now on. Because Jesus is talking about the destruction, the coming of the kingdom. And so that's possibly what is meant. One man is taken by an angel, one woman in a grinding wheel will be taken, and the other one left. So, again, this doesn't seem to imply a secret rapture, because up in verse 30, Jesus has said it's going to be a sign. The whole world will see it. There'll be a trumpet blast, and so it doesn't teach the secret rapture. But there's another way to look at these verses also. Jesus, in his example, he's saying nobody's going to know the day or the hour. And look in verse 37. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying, getting in marriage, up to the day of Noah, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. So what happened to those who did not live right, did not have a relationship with the Lord when the flood came? What does the text say? Read it. What does yours say, Greg?
For those days they are eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away.
Took them all away. Now, when I asked you what happened, you said he destroyed them, but the text said he took them away. And now we know that what that means is he destroyed them, right? Okay. Now you got 2 men in the field, and one is taken. What does that tell us about that person?
He's saved.
Wait a minute now. The ones in Noah's day who were taken weren't saved.
Either you're saved or you're unsaved.
I understand, but what I'm getting at, Sue, is right. So what I'm getting at is if if the ones in Noah's day, the term is they were taken, meaning they're destroyed, then it could be these two men who are in the field, the one who's taken is destroyed, while the one that's left is left there for the angels to take him up to meet the Lord. You see, if we take the language of it's someone that's taken, meaning they're destroyed, which is what happened in the days of Noah, the ones who were taken were the ones who were destroyed.
Does that mean they are sent to hell, or what does destroy mean?
Yeah, they're destroyed. Some of them will.
Everybody, at the end of the day, is judged, aren't they?
Right.
How can they just disappear?
Well, did the ones in Noah's day just disappear? We don't, they were just destroyed, okay? They were wiped out.
Does that mean they were sent to hell?
Well,
They weren't declared righteous?
they weren't, that's it. They were judged for that day. They weren't declared righteous. Sonia?
Well, we have to go back to verse 31st, and it says that the angels will go and gather those from all. So that means the one who was taken away was gathered.
Not necessarily.
While the other one, it says the flood, you know, it
Right.
tells before the water destroyed
Right.
them.
Well, see, and again, this doctrine of the left behind stuff, that has influenced our thinking so much that when we see one's taken and one's left, we instantly assume taken up and left behind. But the ones in Noah's day, the ones that were taken were wiped out.
Right.
The one that was left behind was on a boat and he was saved.
But in Noah's days, it explains that they were not taken by an angel. It says the flood, and when you're taken by the flood, I mean, it's two different things.
It doesn't say they were
Taken-
taken away by the flood, does it?
It says, and he knew not until the flood came and took them all away.
Right.
So the flood,
I understand, but the term that's used for their destruction is they were taken away.
okay.
And so if that's the case, then to be taken or taken away equals destroyed. Or, as Peggy said, declared unrighteous. Okay? And so if that's the case, then if to be taken means to be destroyed or declared unrighteous, what does to be left mean? Left would mean that you are righteous. Or saved. And like I said, if we were to read this story without this left behind language in our minds, Jesus is talking about at that day of judgment, those who are unrighteous will be taken. And those that are left will be left to be gathered by the angels. So, Greg, and then Jerry.
I can see how it can be confusing
Mm-hmm.
with the language that is given here.
Mm-hmm.
But when we go back to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 16 and 17, and I read 16 just to kind of put it in perspective, but 17 to kind of explain it a little
Okay.
bit better. It says, "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first, hence taken away up into heaven." Now listen to verse 17. "Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air."
We who are alive
We who are left,
and left.
yeah,
Right.
shall be caught up. So I can see how it can be confusing to it. But when you contrast it with the day of Noah, we know that those that were left were washed away and destroyed, and in our mind, drowned in,
But those weren't the ones who were left, those were the ones who were
taken
taken.
away. Okay. Taken away
But
by,
left on land.
yeah, I guess that, yeah. 'Cause you know what?
Right.
Anyway.
Anyways, Jerry had a comment first.
So if I had a bumper sticker that said, in case of rapture, this vehicle will be unmanned, that's not good
That's
for
not a good thing.
for me,
And that's
having the
exactly-
bumper
That is
sticker.
exactly the point. If this understanding is correct, we want to be left behind.
We don't want to be the unmanned.
That's right. That's exactly right. So Sonia and
So does it really make a difference? I mean, one will be,
just stop right there. You're going to use the rest of my class for me. No, go ahead, Sonia.
yeah, one will be declared unrighteous and one will be declared righteous. So it doesn't matter if the ones who are declared unrighteous are taken to a place where they have to wait. And we have to wait right here until judgment. Judgment is going to be judgment.
And it's all going to happen at the same time, and that's the big thing. Those that are taken, if they're destroyed, then the ones that are left will be gathered. But yeah, you actually had your hand up before Sue, so.
Well, I still have not decided for sure. In the end, anyway, all those who are destroyed would still be judged.
Yes.
They've already
Yes.
been kind of judged, but they
On the
will be.
last day, we're already judged. In fact, we are already judged now, okay? And this is my understanding of this, is that we are already judged. We've already been either declared righteous or we've been declared unrighteous based upon our relationship with Jesus Christ. On the final day will be the day that we're like the sheep going through the cutting sheet, where you either go there or you go here. So,
I was just gonna say what Sonia did. When Jesus said these words, he's saying either, when he comes again, you're either gonna be saved or you're gonna go to hell.
you can't ride the
You have to
fence.
get ready.
Yeah, well, look in verse 42. Look at verse 42 of Matthew 24. And every time, even when Paul talks about the end of days, this is the main emphasis. Verse 24. Therefore keep watch, because you don't know when the day of your Lord will come. You need to be ready. You need to make sure that you have that relationship with Him so that when He returns, you will be in the right spot. You will be where you will be with Him. Okay?
Well, I was just gonna mention, Lance, in John 5, where it talks about the hour cometh and now is, and when all that are in the tomb shall hear His voice, some to the resurrection of life, and some into resurrection of judgment. So it doesn't matter, I guess, in some sense, what all takes place, but everybody's gonna be raised, and everybody's gonna go either to life or to judgment.
Right.
The second thought, I was wondering about was in verse 34 about of Matthew 24 about the generation shall not pass till all these things be accomplished. And so it seems like the previous verses there are going to take place before this generation is gone. And so it does make it a little complicated to try and fit that to the end of time when those things will happen during their generation.
Okay.
So, one of the commentaries that I read explained this kind of this way. Jesus is talking about the coming of and the establishment of a new kingdom, a new reign. Okay, that's what's going to happen when He returns. Is the kingdom of God is going to exist in its wholeness, in its purity. And He said, and I'll give you this example, and I don't want to use a current event that's happening in our history today, or in our world today, because then we'll get political, and I don't want to do that. But think hypothetically with me for a moment, okay? And let's say that the United States as a nation has just gone down the tubes so bad that we are so morally corrupt. There's such great violence. I mean, our country has just sunk to the depths of the bowels of corruption, okay? And I mean, it's just terrible. And Canada, the Canadian Prime Minister, whoever the big honcho is up there, sends out a memo and you know, flies a plane over and drops leaflets out. We pick them up and it says, "We are coming to invade your country. We are going to wipe out all the evil that is there. And only the good and the righteous who have aligned themselves with us will be saved." And he says it's going to, when we come, it's going to be like in the days of Noah. You guys aren't going to know when we come. You're going to be going about your business, and we're going to show up, and those who haven't aligned themselves with us are going to be taken. Now, in that situation, what would taken mean? Destroyed or taken captive, in prison. And he goes on and he writes in this letter and he says, when we show up, there will be two guys out in the field. One's going to be taken, the other one's going to be left. What's that taken mean? Captivity, bondage. And so if it's taken that, if we understand it that way, again, then those who are taken are those who have not aligned themselves with the kingdom. Those who are left are the ones who have aligned themselves with the kingdom. And again, this is just the opposite of the whole left behind thing. Because if you take that doctrine of the secret rapture and you impose it on this text, then the taken are the ones who have the empty cars sitting there. Okay?
Actually, Noah and his family were looking for this to happen too.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So those that are his are looking for this second coming.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a very good point, David. Yeah. Those who are looking for the second coming will be preparing for the, you know, Noah is such a great example. You know, God told him, says, I'm going to do this. You need to build a boat. You know, which is the same thing Jesus said. I'm going to do this. You need to get on board. And, you know, people today, kind of like, you know, those in Noah's time, you know, walk around and they look at us and they say, well, why are you guys doing, you know, I get that all the time. Why do you go to church 3 times a week? You know, well, I'm building my boat. My boat will leak if I don't have other experienced boat builders with me to help me get my boat in shape. And then, you know, the others, you know, well, that's not really, whatever. You know, don't really know if I believe in that or not. Well, there will come a time when they do believe in it. The only problem is that it will be too late. In fact, that may be him.
That better be God.
No trumpet calls these days, just everyone's cell phone will ring at the same time. All right. The thing that I wanted to point out is this Matthew chapter 24 text, in the text itself, there's really nothing to indicate a secret rapture. When it's connected with what Jesus is talking about, beginning in verse 30, there is evidence that's seen and known by everyone who's around. You have to begin with that doctrine to make the connection there. Without that doctrine, the text seems to lead to one of these other two meanings. Either the ones taken are taken by the angel, or the ones taken are taken to destruction. Now, as I'm preaching through Matthew 24, or through Matthew, we will deal with this text again. This week, I'm leaning towards this understanding of it. By the time I get there in my sermon series, I may have said, no, I think the other one's a stronger argument. But either way you come down on it, it doesn't seem to teach this secret rapture. Okay? And again, the most important lesson is in verse 42. Therefore, keep watch. As Peggy pointed out, you know, Noah was watching for this. You know, all of our life should be lived looking for that second coming and expecting it at any moment and being prepared for it when it gets here. Okay? Any other questions or comments?
I don't know whether we brought out Revelations 1:7 or not, but it said every eye will see the Lord.
Right.
I don't think we brought it out. But if you want to be interested in the terminology in Matthew 24, read Isaiah 13 chapter, 19 chapter, because it gives a picture of doom and gloom, personification of judgment. And I give you verse 19.
Hang on just a second, Harley. Everybody turn over to Isaiah. You said 13, Harley?
Well, let's go to 19 first.
Isaiah 19?
Yeah.
And the reason, Harley, I appreciate you bringing that up because what we're going to continue talking about is John's, the way John sees himself as a prophet and the way he was influenced by these Old Testament prophets. And so you've actually kind of segued into where we need to go. So you said Isaiah chapter 19?
Yeah, verse 1, the judgment will come upon Egypt because of the way they treated God's people. So,
Okay.
verse 1 says, behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and is about to come to Egypt. So we see here the terminology used in, like in 24. But the Lord is used here as a swift cloud too. But it's in judgment.
And that's what I was going to say. And again, we have to understand that based upon a lot of the Old Testament texts, when the Lord comes, descending on, or comes on clouds, not only is that bringing redemption, but it's also bringing judgment. It all comes at the same time.
Now, if you turn over to the 13th chapter, it's against Babylon in verse 1. And then you go down to verse 9 and says, behold, the day of the Lord is coming, cruel, and it goes ahead and personificates down through 16 of how awful that's going to be. The moon will not shed its light, it will punish the world. So we draw a picture of doom and gloom for the judgment.
Yes.
And it helps us understand the Old Testament language when we talk about Matthew.
Well, and not only that, but understanding that Old Testament language helps us understand Revelation as well. And that's kind of what I want us to continue on with. If no one had any other comments about the Matthew 24 verses, then I'd like for us to go back. Last week,
Lance,
yes.
did you bring up the parallel passages of Luke 21 and Mark 13?
No, I did not.
Because if you put those passages right up next to each other, there's a break in the text where Matthew seems to have gone further and answered an extra question about the end of the world, whereas Luke and Mark only answer the question, when's the temple going to be destroyed?
Right.
But it does, and Luke actually says, in the place it says, let the reader understand when you see the abomination of desolation. He says there that that's the armies of Jerusalem, armies of Rome surrounding Jerusalem. So that clearly is referring to the destruction of the temple.
Right.
And then they go right down in parallel. Then these two stop, and then you have Jesus say, but about that hour, no man knows. And then says the one will be taken in the field, another left. So that part does have to do with the end, whether it's rapture or not. That could all occur at once. There couldn't be. There might not be a division.
Right. Well, I did.
The first part.
I did bring up that in Matthew 24, I think Jesus begins by talking about the destruction, the literal physical destruction of Jerusalem, but then he gets into his return, the second coming, if you want to put it that way. And then your part there in the middle about these will be fulfilled before this generation. You know, then the question is, was he referring in that to the destruction of Jerusalem or the other things? And that's still the question.
Mine says people
And will remain the question.
standing right here will see it.
Yeah.
Whereas, so that can't be this generation. It's the one that's existing at the end, because he's telling those hearers, you guys will see it.
Right.
So unless there's 2,000-year-old people running around.
Yeah. Someone said that this generation should be understood that at some point in history, a generation will occur Jesus is speaking about this generation, but it's not even in existence yet, but it's very clear that Jesus is talking about the ones that are here, you know, so, but that's taking us off of where we need to get to. I want us to go back and look at a couple of things in the text of Revelation, because as we were talking about last week, a lot of times we get this idea that John sees himself, and it's because we see the book of Revelation as this mysterious end time journal kind of thing. And John sees himself as a prophet. And the background for that is the Old Testament prophets. But he sees himself as a prophet. He sees this word as a prophecy. Look over in Revelation chapter 22, verse 6. Revelation 22, verse 6. It says, the angel said to me, these words are trustworthy and true. The Lord, the God of the spirits of the prophet, sent his angel to show his servants the things that must soon take place. So again, and then in verse 7, behold, I am coming soon. Blessed is he who keeps the words of this, the words of the prophecy in this book. And so John, having received this message, would understand that this is prophecy. Look over in chapter 10, verse 11. Then I was told, you must prophesy again about many peoples, nations, languages, and kings. John tells us that he was given instruction to prophesy. And then in chapter 19, verse 10. At this time I fell at his feet to worship him, but he said to me, do not do it. I am a fellow servant with you and with your brothers who hold to the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. And so John understands his mission to be a mission of prophecy. And he's going to be very, very shaped by his understanding of the Old Testament prophets. And so I want to look a little bit about that Old Testament heritage that would be influencing John. You see, for John, a prophet was not just an end-of-times ministry. John saw himself, much like the prophets, his prophetic ancestors, seeing the pagan influences everywhere around him and influencing God's people. Now, this is something that Israel had dealt with throughout their history, is being influenced by the cultures and the peoples around them. And so in order to deal with that, God would send prophets to warn them. And so just like Israel in the past was tempted to assimilate with the surrounding cultures, and they needed a prophetic voice to call them back, God sees himself as the same kind of prophet. John draws a lot upon the Old Testament materials. Harley was reading, about the moon and the sun and all these symbolic things that will take place. And we're going to see a lot of that same kind of language. You go back and you've got Moses prophesying that there's going to be these plagues. And John prophesies that there are going to be plagues. A lot of the imagery that we get from the Old Testament is very similar to John's imagery. And so he was definitely influenced by the language of the Old Testament. In fact, he was so familiar with the Old Testament prophets and their language. It's interesting that in the book of Revelation, he never just quotes Old Testament. You know, if you read through Jesus' teaching and Paul's teaching and other places, they'll say, you know, Matthew's real good about it. You know, this happened to fulfill what was said through the prophet Isaiah, and then he quotes Isaiah. Or Jesus will say, you have heard that it was said, and he will quote from the Old Testament. In the Revelation, John never quotes from these Old Testament things, but it's like he takes their language and he takes their way of communication and he just makes it his own, using a lot of the same kind of imagery and everything else. So,
Do you think he used that language because the people were familiar with it and understood it, while we don't because we don't?
you are so good. Next week, Sonia will be teaching this class. You are right on the money, Sonia. You actually got ahead a couple of points, but you're exactly right on the money. John was so familiar with this language because he was steeped in this stuff, okay? And I think he expected that his readers would make the same connections that he did. And I think one of the reasons we don't is because we don't read the Old Testament prophets. When was the last time any of you sat down and read Ezekiel? Any of you read Ezekiel within the last year? A couple? All right, that's good. That's good. Jeremiah? Within the last year? Elisha?
Kings, yeah.
Okay.
We're in,
Okay, there we
we're in
go.
the
There we go.
Kings. Ahab.
As there was another teachers pointed out, because of this being a persecution theory against Christians, they were using this kind of language to throw the Romans off, because the Romans, if John had been talking directly in their language to the Romans, they would have been killed. So we had to use this kind of terminology to disguise what he was talking about, that they only knew.
Right.
The other thing, and then I'll put, Matthew 24:14, for this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world for a witness to all the nations, and then the end shall come. And then in Colossians 1:23, I indeed will continue in the faith firmly, established steadfast, not moving away from the hope of the gospel that you have heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and I, Paul, was made minister. So that's directly then talking about the gospel preached before 70 AD, because Paul had witnessed Paul to the unknown world, but to the known world, the gospel had been preached. Paul said, I was a witness. So he's in verse 14, Jesus said, then the end come after he comes to preach Paul. So Paul identifies that in the gospel.
Okay. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but I do want to go back and talk about what you brought up about the language, and about the language being written so that, like for instance, if somebody captured that book, if it fell into the wrong hands, nobody would know what it was talking about. And that was a very common teaching. I thought you were your brother and I was going to throw this at you. If you have to hang on just 1 second though, because I do want to make this point. We are going to talk about it a little more. For years, we understood Revelation to be written in the context of just widespread, imperialistically imposed persecution of the church. And under that kind of situation, then yeah, you might want to write some secret stuff, because if you're caught, you're going to be killed. The problem is, archaeology and history have shown that there never was that imperially worldwide persecution of the Christians. There were small pockets of it for very brief periods of time. And so more and more scholars are beginning to think it wasn't written in a secret language to hide it, because after all, what's the name of the book? Revelation. To make known. And so the thinking is leaning more now, it wasn't written in a code language to hide it, but it was just written in language that would reveal it. And it would reveal it if the people were familiar with the Old Testament prophets. If they were steeped in that language, it would just be clear. It would make known to them what was going on. And so we're going to talk a little more about the language that's used and how or why he would use the language that he did. Hey there, little girl. How are you? So, all right, we're going to stop right there. We'll pick up next week.